In our Worst Punishment series, we've described horrific atrocities men have done to each other in the name of justice. The punishments we've reviewed here have been utilized at various points in history and in various places, with each provider of pain putting its own twist on the punishment. In ancient times, the Chinese might have flayed an enemy's back flesh, but might have just flayed a person's face as a stern warning, whereas a lesser crime in 14th century Europe could have gotten you flayed from head to toe, castrated and beheaded for good measure. We decided to begin the final part of the series with a torture that is often said to be the worst kind of torture that has ever existed in recorded history. We say that, but it's not easy to invoke the superlative when people are being boiled in a pot and having their skin peeled off. Rat torture. Humans have a long history of inventing new ways to harm one another. There seemed to be no limit to the horrible torture devices that humans have devised. However, one of the most horrible ways of torture ever devised does not require the use of any man-made device at all. Instead, a rat is all that is required. Many individuals are inherently afraid of rats and dislike them, and the animals will eat almost anything, including human flesh. As a result, they are ideal torture tools, especially if the torturer was familiar with how to utilize them. One of the more bizarre forms of rat torture is placing a rat inside a half cage and above the abdomen of a shackled person. The cage is then gradually heated. Desperate to escape the heat, the rat begins to tunnel through the victim's flesh, the only soft surface it can find. The rat immediately gnaws its way into the victim's bowels with strong claws and teeth, inflicting intense pain and terror. During the Dutch revolt in 17th century Europe, one of the first documented applications of this diabolical strategy happened, with Dutch leader Diederik Sonnet notoriously employing it against captive prisoners. However, the approach was also used in the late 20th century. During his reign, Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet allegedly tortured political opponents with rats. The thought of a rat eating their guts or merely crawling over their limbs while they slept terrified people. When a torturer is attempting to obtain information from someone, fear is often a more powerful tactic than physical pain. When the purpose was just to inflict pain, terror was an effective method to add a psychological element to the torture. However, there are just a few specific documented incidents of rat torture being employed. It's possible that the thought of encouraging a rat to chew its way into someone's stomach was so repulsive that even the most hardened sadists were hesitant to use it. Boiling. This is Toyokuni Ichiyosai's iconic Japanese painting of a man carrying his son while being boiled alive. It depicts the tragic narrative of a guy named Ishikawa Goemon, a legendary Japanese criminal and folk hero who lived in the 16th century. He was known as the Robin Hood of Japanese history because he stole from the wealthy and gave to the impoverished. After failing to assassinate Sengoku-era tyrant Toyotomi Hideyoshi, he was apprehended by officials and sentenced to death by boiling. Death by boiling is a technique of execution that involves immersing a victim in a boiling liquid, water, oil, tar, or even wine. This practice was widespread throughout Europe and Asia. Death by boiling is an exceedingly painful method of execution due to the protracted procedure. A huge vessel, such as a cauldron or a sealed kettle filled with liquid, was used for this sort of execution. During King Henry VIII's reign, an incident occurred in which the Bishop of Rochester's cook, Richard Roos, poisoned numerous persons, resulting in some deaths. He was sentenced to death by suffocation. Unlike others who were just thrown into the boiling liquid, Roos was repeatedly dropped into it and pulled out. They went through this process again and again till he died. How does it make you feel, you may wonder? Being cooked alive is not something anyone wants to go through. According to accounts, the procedure is lengthy and excruciatingly unpleasant. Once boiling water reaches your body, your limbs and extremities will be the first to aggressively burn, and your fingers have more nerve endings than many other regions, so you will feel it and it will be excruciatingly painful. Your internals will follow when your outward body begins to cook. Every organ in your body is heated and boiled. To make matters worse, it would not immediately kill you. Victims suffer excruciating pain unless they go into shock. If they don't die from shock, they'll live long enough to smell their own flesh cooking. Historians argue that this torture method was meant for the worst offenders, but included people who didn't subscribe to channels they love, and despite the fact that it's no longer used, we recommend that you subscribe just to be safe. The guillotine. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the French monarchy intended execution to be a terrible fate that would purify the condemned soul before his final judgment, dissuade others from committing the crime, and demonstrate the king's power to inflict painful suffering on his subjects. The spectacle of public executions was half national festivity, half dismal warning. Crowds gathered to witness the prisoners' bodily torments, which were almost too horrifying to contemplate. Scorching pokers, molten lead poured into wounds, dismembering hooks, and of course, the horses ready to draw and quarter. One of the numerous goals of the French Revolution, which lasted from 1789 to 1815, was to level society by removing noble privileges that lorded over commoners. Dr. Joseph Guillotine presented plans for a bladed machine to execute offenders to the French National Assembly on October 10, 1789, as a remedy to unequal means of execution and social equality. It would be simple to use, function quickly, and treat all prisoners equally, regardless of social background. In March 1791, his proposals became legislation, and the guillotine was utilized for execution the following year. The so-called national razor shaved the heads of both the royal family and the most common criminals. It leveled bodies and society, subjecting all citizens to the same punishment. And it put an end to the monarchy's capricious torturing of the condemned, as well as the privilege that nobles possessed, including the way in which they died. The guillotine was a killing machine that not only supplied a simple method of death, but also the appropriate political and intellectual message for the revolution. The French Revolution eventually got increasingly politically radical, transitioning from a system in which the king continued to govern under a constitutional structure to a republic in which the people's representatives wielded political power to a de facto dictatorship. As the revolution became more radical and politicians saw plots everywhere, a growing number of individuals were executed. With the need to execute a large number of captives, the guillotine was put to increased usage. The most conservative estimate of the number of French executed during the Terror was 17,000 people. This figure almost entirely consisted of people charged with political offenses. Spanish donkey. Although the Spanish donkey may appear to be a pricey cocktail, the pain it delivered was considerably worse than a hangover. The wooden horse, also known as the chevalet, was a torture device used by Jesuits, Civil War soldiers, and even Paul Revere himself. While the implementation went through several changes, all known versions generally worked the same way. The Spanish donkey was primarily made of wood. The first known type was a triangular prism on stilts, with victims forced to straddle the wedge's sharp corner. It's unknown who invented the torture apparatus, although it was most likely created by the Spanish Inquisition and used to punish non-believers. Victims were stripped naked and shackled before being ridden on the wooden horse, and they were frequently tickled and had weights connected to their feet to add to the anguish. They stayed on the device until they couldn't handle the horrific pain any longer and bled to death. Other medieval torture devices may have appeared more terrible at first appearance, but this innocent wooden horse was right up there with the rack and wheel, and it was ridden for decades. Despite the fact that the Spanish donkey was designed to elicit pain rather than death, several people were killed by the device. Its victims' genitals were almost invariably damaged by a pointed piece of wood pushed between their legs. Victims' perineum and scrotum frequently split open, especially when they were carried from one end of the wooden horse to the other. Other unfortunate folks had their tailbones shattered. Although it was first utilized in medieval times, the Spanish donkey did not survive. According to Geoffrey Abbott's execution, the Spanish army used the weapon incessantly until the 1800s. It was commonly used to chastise soldiers, and some victims allegedly split in half when heavier and heavier weights were put on their ankles. The British also utilized the Spanish donkey, and they even added a carved horse's head and tufted tail to the contraption, making it both a form of punishment and a source of fun for observers. However, due to the obvious risk of mortality, the British eventually abandoned the practice. Because the injuries frequently rendered soldiers debilitated and unsuitable to fight, the punishment was finally stopped. While the Spanish donkey has thankfully become a bygone era, it definitely injured and murdered hundreds throughout the decades. It would be easy to cheer its abolition and celebrate humanity's progress if it weren't for the growth of torture and its present hidden practice. Thank you for watching today's video, and if you did enjoy it, subscribe and watch this video to know about modern-day torture in Nazi concentration camps.